pearl fishing in the Gulf session at the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. My name is Toby Gregory, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next hour. Personally, I'm hugely excited about this session. I read the book firstly for research and because I had to, but I read it a second and third time because it's so absorbing and quite captivating. And it's a mixture of the text, the way it's written, but also the imagery they've been able to select. And it's incredibly powerful. And so it's a great honor of mine to be able to introduce Dr. Robert Carter this afternoon. Dr. Carter is an archaeologist and a historian with over 30 years of research in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So reading through the book, obviously it contains an awful lot of detail, but what's very clear is your passion, your drive, and it's almost a love of labor. Talk to me about how this started.
Well, all my life I've been interested in discovery, in finding out new information, finding new things, knowing that you're the first person to uncover a particular fact or idea or object, or maybe the first person to see something for thousands of years. Fundamentally, that's why I became an archaeologist, because I like to turn over stones and see what's there, in both a literal and a figurative sense. I actually didn't start studying archaeology until after my undergraduate degree. I got slightly unwillingly channeled into history by my school. Found history at the time rather dry. But I was much more attracted by the fact that by archaeology, because when you're digging a site or examining a collection for the first time, you're the first person to have the opportunity to put your thinking on it, your understanding, your interpretation. Whereas a lot of the history that you read as an undergraduate, certainly, is basically already been written by other people, and you're just deciding who you believe the best, whereas you get the original information, the data, the primary data as an archaeologist. Actually, of course, as you know, because I'm here, in later years I returned to history with my study of the pearl fishery. So I came back to it, if you like, and of course found it much more interesting as an adult, if you will. And got very much absorbed by the entire history of the region, but of course, particularly that history relating to the pearl fishery.
And you're talking there about, your passion and how that developed, and discovering something that perhaps hasn't been seen for 5,000 years, and you're the first eyes on it since that time. Can you remember your first discovery?
As an archaeologist? Well, it was a long time ago. It must have been in the mid-1990s. I think it was, obviously, the moment you step onto an archaeological site, you are finding objects. It's usually broken pottery, which is not very impressive to look at, but informative from a research point of view. But of course, it's exciting because, you've dug it up or you've picked it up. One object I particularly remember, I found a nice lid, the lid of a carved stone vessel with a nice knob on it, nicely carved with patterns. At the first site I excavated, and I was quite pleased about this, and I showed it to the site director with a potsherd that I'd found which had a pattern on it, and he was actually rather dismissive because he'd seen hundreds of these things before, and it was like, oh yeah, just another Iron Age soft stone lid. But to me it was much more exciting than that, because it was the first complete object that I'd found that could have gone into a museum, so yeah, probably that one.
And obviously, so post your studies at Oxford, you gently made your way across and eventually arrived in the Gulf.
That's right.
What was it that brought you here?
Well, actually, I did. I converted to archaeology. I did a master's in archaeology, and there was a course in Arabian archaeology, and it wasn't being taught anywhere else in the world. It was a pioneering field at the time. People had been doing archaeology in the Gulf actually since the 1950s, formally, but there was huge areas that were not covered, that were not known, great stretches of history and prehistory that were not studied archaeologically. So I knew it was a place where you could make new discoveries all the time, and that was what was very attractive to me. So I came to the Emirates first. I worked in Sharjah on the east coast at Kalba. Then I moved over to Bahrain, and I came back and did work in the Emirates, in Abu Dhabi Emirate. I did work in Ras Al Khaimah as well. Since then, I've worked in Kuwait, a little tiny bit in Saudi Arabia, also Iran, also Iraq. But always in the Gulf region, except actually I worked in northern Iraq for a bit. Yeah.
And the focus at the time was on pearls, or
No. No, I started out as a much more straightforward archaeologist, interested in prehistory, Bronze Age trade, maritime trade, and Neolithic, the Neolithic period. So this was a very interesting time in regional history because people were starting to actually leave quite an impression on the archaeological record. In other words, there's a lot of Neolithic archaeology in the region because we're starting to see people. There'd been people here before, but we're starting to find their sites. A lot of them are coastal sites. A lot of them are pearl fishing sites. And in fact, it was actually a pearl from one of those Neolithic sites that we were excavating in Kuwait that stimulated my interest in pearls. In fact, the guy who was in charge of the sieving program, and I think may even have pulled it out of the sieve, is sitting right there, who now works in Abu Dhabi. But I had to find a context for this. I had to write about it. It was a pierced pearl, just one. And what I discovered was that there were many, many Neolithic pearls that had already been discovered in the region. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why were they so interested in pearls in the Neolithic period? This is 7,500 years ago, so it's in the Stone Age. It's a long time ago. And in fact, it was the first early peak of the pearl fishery. When I tried to publish, I thought this was interesting, so I tried to publish an article on the archaeology of pearl fishing, and the publishers said, this is great, but given the amount of history attached to pearl fishing, more recent written history, could you expand on it and write about the archaeology and history of pearl fishing with much more history in it? And then I find myself sucked down this rabbit hole, which became more than a rabbit hole. It became, like a huge labyrinth, a cave system of information, which eventually led to the book. So it started with one little pearl in a Neolithic site in Kuwait. Actually, on that note, seeing as I mentioned the Neolithic, I have some slides.
They're just going to call it up now.
Okay. This is not the pearl. This is actually the oldest pearl that's been found in the Gulf, which is also associated with Mark, because it came out of a site that he's excavating on the island of Marawa. And it's older than the one, it's still Neolithic, but it's a bit older than the one we had in Kuwait, about 5,800 BC, so nearly 8,000 years old. Nice condition. It's only about, 3.5 millimeters across or something. It's nearly 4, something like that. But it's beautiful condition. And you can see on the map, all those red dots are where other pearls have been found from that period. So this was the first flourishing of the pearl fishery. And they were simple people who lived in these stone huts, fishermen's huts. They were herders and fishermen. But they definitely deliberately fished for pearls, both for themselves, because we find it in their jewelry, but also, I think, to trade with the people in Iraq that they were trading by sea at the time. But I should probably not go too much into the details of the Neolithic right now. We don't have time.
And were you aware at this stage of the importance that pearl fishing had for the region, particularly in terms of the fact that it kind of brought everyone to the coast and actually made the area thrive?
I found out fairly quickly when I started studying the first one that interested me, because, of course, I did find the historical works, and actually Frauke Herd-Beyers, who wrote, of course, about the pearl fishery in her book on Emirati history, but there's many others as well. You can't get away from the pearl fishery when you look at the regional history. You can't get away from pearl diving. So I realized how incredibly important it was in later centuries. And what I discovered is that there was, I wouldn't say a continuous history, but a near continuous history of pearl fishing going all the way from this early time all the way through to the mid-20th century. And it became more and more important. Well, after a lapse, there was like nearly a 4,000-year gap after the Neolithic when it wasn't quite so all-consuming, but people were still collecting pearls. And then it became very important again, long before the Greeks and Romans, and peaked in the last 3 centuries when it became the most important thing that was happening in the region.
When you say important, kind of what percentage of the population were involved?
Oh, over the last 3 centuries, so since the 1700s, pretty much everybody who lived on the coast was involved with the pearl fishery or relied on it indirectly. but most of them relied on it directly. So nearly all of the Gulf towns were populated by pearl divers and pearl fishers, haulers, the guys who went on the boats to help the divers. Obviously, trade was important as well, but even this was tied to the pearl fishery. There were so many people living in these towns that they couldn't possibly feed themselves on the fish that they caught or the livestock that they herded. In most of these areas, you can't grow food. In some you can, but most of them you can't. So they had to import all of their food and hardware, and they did that with the money from the pearl fishing. So they were completely reliant on it. And in fact, these towns, which were now the capitals of the Gulf states that we see today, were nearly all founded specifically as pearl and deliberately as pearl fishing towns.
And you were talking about trade there for resource. As I understand it, they even traded to bring in water.
Yes, well, Abu Dhabi is a good example. They didn't produce enough water locally. You could get quite a lot out of shallow wells, but it would run out. So they used to bring in boats of water from the island of Dalma. Kuwait had to bring in its water from the Shatt al-Arab. Doha used to bring in its water from several miles outside town. You know, all these places needed provisioning. Yeah.
And I didn't want to go so early with such a big question, but, you know, would you say the modern Gulf owes more to pearls than it does to oil?
Well, I don't think, well, Abu Dhabi wouldn't exist without pearls. It was, you know, it was the pearl fishing town of a people who already lived in the region. And then when the global pearl market became so hot and so demanding that more and more people were going to the coast to fish for pearls, towns like Abu Dhabi were founded in response. And then they became the most important towns relating to these various societies that lived around the region.
And you're talking about fishing for pearls, you're talking about the numbers that were involved. You know, what did pearl fishing look like at that time? Did they head out onto the water and come back in the same day, or were they out for longer periods?
Well, we have a lot of great data on that, actually. Going mostly, the most detailed information we have, the earliest detailed information we have goes right back to the early Islamic period, to the early Arabic writers, the Abbasid period, basically. But actually, in the last 2-3 centuries, we have lots of detailed accounts by visitors, often European, and then in the 20th century by locals, most particularly Saifa Shamlan from Kuwait. And they tell us a great deal of information about life at sea. And in fact, from the 1940s, the very end of the fishery, and the 1950s, we have lots of beautiful photos, often from oil company archives.
And the boats themselves, they weren't just laden with perhaps a diver or a captain of a ship. You know, there were many different roles and quite a few people. Yeah,
I can illustrate that, actually. We'll skip through this historical stuff. I'm happy to talk about it later. The boats are very crowded. This is a not particularly crowded boat. This is a medium-sized boat, which is not especially crowded. But these guys, they wouldn't just pop in and out of the port to go pearl fishing every day. They would go to sea effectively for 4 months of the year, the 4 summer months. Most of them would have a break in the middle. The biggest boats that went furthest out, especially the ones from Dubai, I think, but the Emirates anyway, sometimes they would be out for the whole 4 months without touching land. And they had to be provisioned. You would get, merchants would turn up with water, with supplies, which they would purchase for pearls. The smaller and medium-sized boats, as I say, would sometimes pop into port. But you also had tiny boats as well. You see at the top there's a picture from somewhere in the UAE where you see some smaller craft, a smaller business, if you like. And of course, they couldn't stay out at sea for long. They would have to go back home. And they couldn't go that deeply because you got oyster banks close inshore as well as the deeper ones out in the Gulf, which are better. The deeper banks are better. So there would be hundreds, actually thousands of these boats every year working quite an organized way, full of people. Pretty much all the menfolk from most of these Gulf towns would be on the boats for the 4 summer months.
So I can imagine if they're going out for that long, they might be quite laden. I understand you've got an image here.
I love this picture. You know, when you see pictures of pearl fishing boats, this is from the Bapco archive, I should say. when you see pictures of pearl fishing boats, they're often pictures of reconstructions or dives that were performed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as kind of a way of recording history and a way of commemorating it. When you see the earlier pictures from the 50s, 40s, and before, it's a very different picture. So this is all the divers' possessions, their clothes, which wasn't very much, the equipment, and because there were so many people on the boat, you had to hang it off the sides. And you had to live on this boat with all these other guys for all this time. Some of the very crowded boats, they would have to sleep in shifts. They would be sleeping on the equipment, they'd be sleeping on the piles of oysters. Let me show you. So this is an example of some of the rowers at work rowing out on the banks, probably to a better spot to dive, and hauling in the anchor. And this is actually the guys diving. So each diver would have a counterpart, a hauler. And the diver would go down with a stone, which the hauler would then pull up. It was on a rope. But there was a second rope attached to the diver's basket. When the diver's basket was full, the hauler would pull up the diver and the basket. And that was actually a very important job because you could drown if the ropes got tangled if you weren't pulled up in time. And you see, this is a proper working boat. It's a big, dirty old boat, all stained. You know, it's been at sea for a couple of months probably already when this was taken. And these are the oysters. So every morning you would open the oysters you caught the day before. It was the first job of the day. As the temperature rose, because the divers would actually get cold even in summer because they were underwater in cold water, you had to sit around and open the oysters. And this is a messy, stinky job. So you were doing this for literally months on end every year.
So these have obviously come from the pearl beds, and the Gulf waters were famed for their pearls. You know, why was that, and what made them so good?
We don't know. Well, we know that they were the most productive beds in the world. So not only did they produce the most oysters, they also produced the most pearls and the best pearls. And also, they didn't seem to be exhausted. There were times when the catch would decline and people would worry that it was overfished, but it always came back. So other fisheries around the world were much smaller, and when they were heavily exploited, they disappeared. So there were New World fisheries in the 16th, 17th century they discovered off Venezuela and Panama and places, which were fished out very quickly and vanished. There's a very important fishery in South India, between India and Sri Lanka, in the Gulf of Mannar. But sometimes it would go for 7 years without producing any oysters. So every year you could guarantee getting some kind of a harvest from the Gulf, even if it wasn't a particularly good one. But in many years you'd get amazing harvests.
And within the Gulf region, are all the pearls the same, or are they quite different?
Well, I have to be careful what I say here, because each Gulf country claims that they had the best pearls. I have to say the prevailing opinion in the mid-20th century and before was that Bahrain produced the best fine pearls. And it was the center of the industry, and the Bahrain banks were thought to have been the most productive. But actually, you know, the Emirates and Abu Dhabi also had access to extraordinary banks, and you could find an amazing pearl anywhere. It's just a matter of statistics. How many amazing pearls do you get from any spot?
And how were they valued? Obviously, everyone has a different opinion, but
Yeah.
from your research, what do you know?
Well, most pearls were of low value. They were small, discolored, brown sometimes, without good luster, very tiny, less than 2 millimeters. They were used. They were sewn onto clothes. The really bad ones were even used as medicine. They were ground up. The best pearl, of course, is a large, round one with a perfect luster. And you would be incredibly lucky to find one of them. You would have to open tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of oysters to get the highest grade of pearl, a G1 or, you know, a Dana. And the evaluation was done by merchants using a lot of very ancient weights and measures, some of which go back more than 1,000 years. Actually, I've got some merchant equipment I can show you.
Well, we changed slides. I do have a different question. One of the things that struck me most about the book wasn't just the detail and your passion for the subject. It was also the rich imagery and the way
Yeah.
the images kind of pop off the page, it really bring everything you learn to life. How easy was it to get good images?
Well, you have to get them from a variety of sources. Most of the museums in the region have equipment like this, but for the historical imagery, the best ones belong to, there's one or two private collections, the best ones belong to the oil companies, because they were, they had photographers and film people out there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's a few expat collections here and there. I mean, it's very varied. Some of the British administrators would take photos of pearl fishing as well. That's a research topic in its own right, to be honest.
And how long did it take? Because obviously there were two books. There was the original book and this new abridged version.
Yeah.
You know, in total, there's a lot of work that's gone into it.
Well, because it became something of an obsession, it was. I managed to get an award or a sponsorship to write the first book, and it wasn't that much, but I said, I think I can get that done in a year, which was absolutely insane because I was actually having to do other things as well. So it actually took more like 2.5 or 3 years to write. But I'd already done a lot of the research previously because I'd been working on an extended article, I'd been working on pearls, I'd just been following my nose. The new version, the edited version, which has got half the amount of sort of detailed data in it, is much more readable. That didn't take so long to do. I had to put in some new material. I had to update it. I wanted to talk more about pearl fishing today, or pearling heritage today. So there was some more research that was needed. But the bulk of the research came for the first version. And yeah, I mean, I guess you could say it was the culmination of about 7 years of research, but mostly concentrated into 2.5 years at the end.
And obviously there was a time when the pearl industry was absolutely booming, but it kind of came to a shuddering stop. You know, what do you think caused that?
Well, mainly the cultured pearl. So the pearl fishery peaked in 1912. And then that was a huge peak. It's an extraordinary peak. That, the value of the harvest at that time was something like 8 times what it had been a few years before, and 30 times what it had been a decade or two before. This is because of price rises, because demand was so high, especially in the West, that prices were just doubling every year and sometimes tripling. And that was bound to collapse. So the first collapse came in 1912 when there was jitters in the European markets because they were worried about instability, political and the potential of war in the Balkans. So the peak was in 1912, the first collapse was in 1913, and at the start of World War I, it dropped to almost nothing. But it recovered. It got back to more normal levels, more, if you like, sustainable levels of income and harvest until the advent of the cultured pearl. And when these were developed in the 1920s in Japan by Mikimoto, it meant that because they were large and beautiful and couldn't be distinguished from natural pearls and could be made for 1/100th of the cost of the natural pearl harvest, it completely devalued pearls of all kinds, and they became no longer fashionable.
We talked earlier about the percentages of the population involved, in the trade. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, you're looking at sometimes 80% of the population.
Yeah.
So as there was a move towards the bust, what happened to the population and what was life like here at that time?
It was really tough. It was a disaster. I'm not afraid to use that word. Oil exploitation had begun in some Gulf states. So some of them did better than others. A lot of, so in Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, some towns were still expanding, people were building new things. Pretty much everywhere else froze and became depopulated. Now actually, oil concession money was already there, and that's what kept some of these towns and emirates afloat. It wasn't anything like the money you get from direct oil revenues, but it stopped these towns from completely disappearing. But many of them did shrink. Doha went down to less than half the size. Abu Dhabi shrunk to really little more than a village. People lived off what they could from the traditional industries of, herding, fishing, a little bit of agriculture here and there. But mostly they lived off handouts from the sheikhs who were getting oil concession money.
So as we move through the oil concession and, the 60s and eventually the 70s, what did pearl fishing look like at that time? And where are we today with it?
Well, people were glad to get rid of it because the last years of the industry were incredibly tough. Since from its collapse phase between, let's say, 1912 and 1950, it wasn't well remembered. Everybody was in debt. Some people were starving. People had to immigrate. And of course, you've seen it was a tough life. You're on a boat, and you get very little money at the end of the season. Sometimes you're always you owed more money than you earned normally as a pearl diver. So there was, I would say, a certain amount of nostalgia for the social solidarity it brought, the shared experience, and the camaraderie you get from hardship. But actually, it's not something that was fondly remembered until maybe decades after it had gone. And now, of course, people understand how important it was, how much current society and the whole political configuration of the region depended on it. People have understood its importance again, and they like to look back at the past and valorize the sacrifices made by their grandparents, basically. In fact, so it's done now as a heritage event sometimes. People go diving. It's sort of heritage. This happens every year in Qatar, for example, and you can go pearl diving, traditional pearl diving in the Emirates as a I wouldn't say a sport, but something a pastime. They have pearl farms, cultured pearl farms now, and any national day here will feature a lot of content based on pearl fishing. The only place where the natural pearl fishery is still alive is in Bahrain. And in fact, there are more pearl divers there now than ever before. Well, not since the 50s. Numbers are going up. And that's because cultured pearls are still banned there, but there's a big demand now for natural pearls, which cannot be fulfilled except by more people going diving. So some people are even now doing it as a full-time job again.
And if we look at the legacy that pearl diving has if we look at the legacy that pearl diving has left, we were talking earlier about the UAE heading into space. We were talking earlier here about the hardships of pearl diving and the connection between the two, always pioneering, always looking ahead and not shy of hardship.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we mustn't underestimate how tough the people of this region are. The fact that they were able to survive even before most of the people in Eastern Arabia became specialized in pearl fishing, it's already a tough environment. And then once you move to a coastal town and have to live off this pearl diving way of life, you need to be able to operate as a team. You need to be able to survive in very harsh conditions. You need to put up with a lot of hardship. And religion was very important to them as a result. But one of the things that people look back on fondly, if you like, is the music of pearl diving as well, which of course was a group event on the boats. There was basically a toughness and a self-sufficiency in the character which enabled us to function. That's how they got through.
So we've done a lot of looking back. If we were to look forward, given this amazing body of work you've pulled together, what's next for you in this realm?
Well, I'm amazingly, despite all the years of research, I'm still finding new things out about pearl diving and pearl diving history and archaeology all the time. So last year we were digging a site which was a freshwater spring in the sea, which had walls around it. They call them a kaukab or chowchub regionally. And it turned out to be, the best interpretation is that it was an 8th century, so an early Abbasid or late Umayyad pearl fishing station to collect, and a provisioning center in the middle of the sea, an island, a man-made island built in the middle of the sea, to provide water and to store goods for the pearl fishing fleet. We had no idea this existed. So this is actually a new archaeological discovery. Every time I go to a museum and look in a collection, I look in all the pearl chests, and I'm always finding new varieties, and they have secret compartments that you can open, and sometimes you find things inside the secret compartments. So I'm always finding or looking for new stuff. Every time there's a new display or a new museum that opens with a pearl fishing section, which they all have in this region, I see some new aspect, a new type of weight or a new thing. I mean, mostly it's repeated, but there's always something coming up. So I am still researching it.
And how many of the new discoveries are made at sea versus on land? Obviously, we're blessed in terms of a lot of land hasn't been used here.
Yeah. Well, we want to explore the pearl beds more closely. So if you have thousands of years of people fishing the pearl banks, you will have thousands of wrecks. So I'm, generally speaking, in various places, I'm trying to start up maritime projects to look at the pearl banks. We've had one team go out to the Bahrain banks, and we found some anchors, traditional anchors. We haven't managed to put together a full program of investigation and survey yet. But, you know, this is also interesting from an ecological point of view as well, because they're quite understudied. They're still there, incidentally. The pearl oysters are still there. They didn't stop fishing them because they ran out. You know, they're actually in quite good condition in many areas. So there's a lot of work that can be done at sea, which I am also trying to bring about. It takes a lot of organization and funding.
And obviously you're deeply passionate about this. I'm now deeply passionate about it, having connected with you and read the book several times. But is there generally a continued thirst for knowledge on this subject? And are we seeing students in the younger age groups come through and explore this?
Yeah, we are, because they're taught a certain amount at school. A lot of slightly inaccurate information floating around as well, because not everything is always remembered correctly. So the book is, the first edition sold out. This edition I hope will do well. We're always working on getting Arabic translations. I'm always being asked to talk about pearl fishing in various venues, so I do what I can, but you know, I have lots of other things to do as well. I think you know, it's not going to go away, and I'm hoping that this book will contribute. Tell you what, I'll put a slide of the book up. How about that? Incidentally, look, this is some beautiful pictures of the fleet, one of the fleets at sea. You can see the crowded boats above the Bahrain banks.
And this may have been, was it May or June as they headed out?
They go out, and it's basically June to September is the main season. You have earlier and later seasons. You had to wait till the winds died down.
The Shamal.
The water clarified, you know, got easier to see. And as I say, when it was warm enough in the water to do it.
I have to say, seeing this, there's a section in your book that talks about dangerous creatures. Just explore a little more about that, if you could.
Yeah. Well, there's one or two stories about sharks, but sharks weren't the main problem. The main problem was spiny lionfish, or they used to call it chicken fish. Is it a lionfish?
It's a lionfish,
yeah. And rays, because rays, when the diver was on the seabed, big rays would come and sit on them, which is a problem, because then you couldn't get disentangled. So rays were, if you like, the most problematic. And then jellyfish and polyps would sting you all the time, which is why you had somewhere, I think I've got a picture of a diver's suit. Uh-oh. What's happening? Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. Excuse me. Where's the diver's suit? There. Of course, not everyone could afford one of these. That was an expensive piece of kit. You know, you've got to be a successful diver to get one of them. Most people just had to suffer the jellyfish stings. Very simple equipment, incidentally, and they've been using this stuff since the dawn of time. You know, the earliest accounts of pearl fishing describe these objects from the 10th century, 9th and 10th century. Anyway, what I was trying to do was publicize my book, so... There it is, that's the new edition.
So as you look at this, and we've talked about it being a labour of love, what's the single one thing that you're most proud of about it?
probably the sheer quantity of information in there. I don't know. I mean, I do lots of other research as well, but I think this is probably the most impactful in terms of what it means to a whole region, potentially.
And is that the combination of the text and the knowledge within it and the imagery? Because for somebody seeing it for the first time, that really popped out.
So we get archaeologists who find old things, and that usually goes into quite specialized literature, but sometimes it makes it into the press. And then we get historians who are mostly interested in the early oil and post-oil period, but who do talk about pearl fishing. But there's not much that brings together the earliest sort of history of pearl fishing, pearl diving, and all the medieval information and the modern period, or the recent centuries as well. So I'm very proud, actually, that I can step from the Neolithic through to the Neolithic period through to the mid-20th century without any problems. I mean, I feel I learnt a lot during this process.
And the way the book is laid out, it's simplified. You know, the chapters allow you to read that as a kind of book in its own right.
I would hope so. I mean, it's very difficult to write when you're talking about essentially finds of pearls and mentions of pearl jewelry and pearl trade, while also trudging through, you know, the history between the 7th century and the 12th century or whatever. You have to try and unify it so it's not just a repetition of facts. You have to try and find something that makes the chapter a bit more interesting. I don't know if I've succeeded, by the way. I mean, you can't tell when you write your own book.
I can tell you have. I wouldn't have read it 3 times otherwise.
The first one was a much harder read because it's packed with information. And it's more of a research tool. But this is something that, yes, you could take it a chapter. It doesn't really matter what order you read them in, to be honest.
The other thing I'd say about it, actually, is it appeals to people of all ages and of all levels of knowledge. I've got a 9-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, and both of them are quite fascinated by it. And again, it's the way it's easily consumable, the chapters, the imagery and the text. I think you've done a fantastic job.
Well, we have to thank my publishers for that as well, and editors.
Who are sitting here in the audience.
Jeff's here, Jeff Eman, and Medina Publishing.
I've asked a lot of questions. I'd love to hear from the audience and know if anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like to ask. I think we've got some roving mics that are coming around. If they aren't, then certainly you can borrow mine. In fact, here it comes on its way to you, just the second row there.
Just a couple of questions. One is, where did the trade go from the Gulf?
Yeah.
Where were they off to be sold? And then when you had this peak in 1900, did the sort of trading route change? And third question, what did the pearl divers do out of pearl season?
So there's some great questions which could take hours to answer if I'm not careful. The trade routes changed through time. So in the medieval period, they were going to the town of Hormuz and the town of Qais on the Iranian shore, and then making their way through Iran and the Caucasus to the Black Sea, and then into the Mediterranean was like one of the major trade routes. By the time we get to the last 3 centuries, they nearly all went to India. Some of them went to Baghdad and Basra. Some of them went through Iran, but the vast majority went to India. This is partly a legacy of the Portuguese because they established a big trading port at Goa, which was then when they were there in power, if you like, in the region. That was the main pearl emporium for the world because they were bringing all their South Seas pearls there as well, and Indian pearls. And then after Goa, it was Surat and Gujarat. And then after Surat, it was Bombay. By the time you get to the 19th and 20th centuries, almost all the pearls go to Bombay, and almost all the goods that are needed by these coastal communities came from Bombay. Almost everything, the food, the hardware, the textiles, most of it came from Bombay, except for the dates, which came from Basra. Yeah. Oh, so there were more questions. Did things change? No, things didn't change at the peak. They followed the pattern that was already in place 200 or 300 years earlier. But there were earlier patterns, which I don't have time to go into. And then what was the last question? Ah, yes. Well, some of them did nothing. I mean, there was nothing else to do in these towns because everything was about pearl fishing. Many of them would go and do casual labor. Some of them would go on the trading boats. There was a winter trading circuit around the Indian Ocean. So some of them would finish their work on the pearl fishing boats, go home for a bit, get straight back on another boat and sail off to Africa or Yemen or India. Many of them would take just casual labouring jobs when they could get it, but there wasn't enough employment in the off-season for everybody, so some of them couldn't do anything really. They would hang around and they would often do work for their captains to whom they owed money. And the captains would provide labour for the merchants to whom they owed money. So there was a lot of unpaid labour that happened in the off-season as well.
We have another question towards the back there.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Irham. I work for pearl oyster culture hatchery in Indonesia, but I just moved to UAE. I work for a new project to develop a pearl farming. All right, my question is, in your opinion, about the successful rate for the pearl after the oyster we sit. In your opinion, is it will be high here in UAE? Because I have tested the seawater quality, which is very high if I compare it to in Indonesia. Here we have the range is from 38 to 41 ppt, which is if in Indonesia, if we have the range salinity, that one will affect the grow rate of the shell length, and then we are gonna harvest our pearl. It will take more than 2 years. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's more and more pearl cultivating operations opening up all around the world. Indonesia is one of the places which is doing a lot more. Salinity is important, but I'm not a biologist. But one of the big questions about the Gulf is why were the Gulf pearls considered to be better with better luster, and why were there more natural pearls, and could that be something to do with the salinity? Another theory is that it's to do with the underwater freshwater springs that you get around. People have said that the pearls around Bahrain might be so good because they were in a very highly saline water, which would occasionally get washed with very low salinity water, and that somehow stimulated the oysters to produce pearls. But actually, the science just isn't there. This has not been studied enough, or if it has been, it hasn't been published. People do study it, but in terms of the natural environment here, as opposed to permaculture, as opposed to the farming, there's not enough studies.
Any more questions? We have a question here at the front. If we could get microphone just here. Just got one microphone coming through. In the meantime, I've got a question for you as well. While we've got a book signing after this, which is free for everyone to attend. So, but apart from that, how do we get a copy of the book?
Well, that's a question I would ask Jeff, to be honest. It's out very recently. You can get it on Amazon. I probably should have asked some questions before I came on stage. I'm not entirely sure what bookshops it's in at the moment, but I know that they're working very hard to distribute it, and I'm just not sure. I can't name any. Jeff, do you want to?
But there is a book signing straight after this, and in fact, we've got a possible answer.
You can buy the book at Magrudy's. It's also available at most bookshops in Dubai and even Ajman now. And then it's available in the UK, Abu Dhabi as well. Yeah, Al Ain, Kinokuniya, and Magrudy's. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Available in all good shops, good bookshops near you.
Please.
Yes, I was wondering, with hundreds and thousands of these pearling boats, and obviously there is no wood anywhere around here, and maybe if you could elaborate about where the wood all came from.
It was Indian wood for the most part. Most of it was teak from Indian forests. Later on in the industry, I think they were having to use other sources of teak from further afield and other woods maybe. this also has not been properly studied because we have no real written records about the, there's oral histories about boat building, and there's very vague economic records that you would know very well, so much wood brought over from India annually to this particular port. I mean, you use more than one kind of wood in a boat as well. So, and to be honest, I would have to refer to Dionysius Agius's books to check your answer and answer it properly.
Also, the wood for building, the chandle, was also brought along.
Get it up close.
Yes, I was just saying that wood had also to be imported for chandle, for the buildings.
That's right.
And that came, I think, largely also from East Africa.
That's right.
So there must have been huge amounts of wood being
Huge quantities of
around.
wood being used.
But I read somewhere also that while this wood was being transported around, they often had people on board who made these out of the wood that they transported. They made out of a big piece of wood, a marvelous tree trunk. They made one of those Einbaum, one of these boats that for one person, but made out of one piece of wood.
Okay,
And
it was like a
these are
huri, I
wonderful.
think.
Yes,
The dugouts.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes the trading boats that were going to pick up the mangroves or other sources of wood from India, mangroves from Africa or building wood from India, they would sometimes give birth to smaller boats on the journey.
Yes.
If they had the right kind of carpenter, they would make a little fishing boat on their big boom or whatever during the journey, and then they would sell it when they get when they find a buyer.
So wood and pearls really is all
Wood and pearls,
intertwined.
actually. There's a study in wood that somebody else, actually one of the boat people should do that. There's a whole lot of maritime archaeologists who love studying archaeological boat wood and have quite a lot of data, actually. But the historical sources are a bit thin. But I'm sure there's more than I know about.
It's quite interesting to see the boats that they were using then, and certainly if you look at the imagery to the boats that you find on the creek now. And also, in addition to that, the global trade that's in and out through DP World, Abu Dhabi ports. So when we talked about the legacy earlier of pearls, it's not just about pearls and making these hubs, but actually it's spawned into many different areas.
Yeah, it's completely tied into inter-regional and international trade. And in fact, the industry, the pearling industry, connected the pearl divers to industries that were happening on the other side of the world. At the peak, they were buying pottery and ceramics, Chinaware, which was being made in Manchester and in Maastricht in the Low Countries.
I think we've got time for one more question. Do you have a question? Yep.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for that. So my question is actually about your recent find that you mentioned, the station. I don't know if there's anything more that you can say about that, like your interpretations on it.
We haven't published it yet because we want to have a second season. It's an extraordinary thing. It's in quite shallow water. We know that they exploited these underwater springs a lot. Now, some of them were in the intertidal zone, and local villagers would go out and collect water at low tide. But often they were in deeper waters, and divers would go down to collect water. And in fact, one of the ways that the pearl boats provisioned themselves with water, if they didn't want to go all the way to shore, they could sometimes navigate to one of these underwater springs, and the divers would collect water in skins. Now, this particular one is in the intertidal zone. It's off the island of Maharak, quite close to the edge of the shallow water. And they built enormous walls across about 80 meters of seabed and then filled them with coral heads that they must have been pulling out from the edge of the reef to make a platform. And in the middle of the platform, they had a circular cistern, which they must have built around the well on the seabed, which they had waterproofed with plaster. None of that survives, so I don't know what kind of plaster. But the cistern survives, but not the waterproofing. But we haven't got to the bottom yet. Next to it, there's some imprints in the surface, which look as though they're the bottom of what could have been a water lifting system, a shaduf, for lifting the water out of the cistern. So that would fill with fresh water, then you would lift it in a bag, dump it in a channel which would run down to the anchorage at the edge of the island. And then the whole island is covered deep with pearl oysters. So the pearl fishers were coming there and opening their oysters on the island sometimes, camping there. It's interleaved with campsite fires and bones. A lot of, this is just in the early Islamic period, but the pearl fishers were still Christian in Bahrain at the time, so there's a lot of pig bone in there. It's really interesting, and it's only half studied. We want to get to the bottom of the well to see if there's anything left of the original lining, and to see, you know, to look at where the water used to. The water doesn't come out anymore because the freshwater aquifer that used to push the water up has been depleted. It's been pumped out. Also, the sea comes in and out of the cistern now through the reclaimed coral head walling. So the water level goes up and down. So we have to excavate the cistern, we have to have a pump constantly running, and then we're in the cistern up to our waist in stinking mud, trying to get to the bottom of it. Unfortunately, the cistern was dug out sometime in the 19th century, probably the 1840s, by one of the Bahraini rulers who camped near the island and was probably investigating it to see if he could get a good freshwater supply himself. So, and then it was used as a picnic spot in later years. People would go to it on a boat and throw carpets and broken plates into it. So it's a proper archaeological site, which goes from the early Islamic period up to the 1960s or later. Sorry, I'm getting distracted.
This is like one of our telephone calls. I do feel that we've only just scratched the surface of this and could go on for some time, so we'll have to have another session at some time. But thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for your time today. I do urge all of you to head across to attend the book signing. It's a rare opportunity, and it's an absolutely fantastic book. The book signing is going to take place just around the corner here. So very close by. We'll stand over there. In fact, just follow us as we wander across after this. But I do also have to say thank you to all of you for patiently listening. If you do have any questions, do feel free to approach Dr. Carter straight after this. I have to thank the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair, the Arabic Language Centre for organising this fabulous event, the AV team and all the volunteers who are standing patiently at the side but have made a lot happen for us today. The translator for the event as well, and we look forward to seeing you at the signing in just a moment. Thank you.
And thank you, Toby, as well, for moderating.